Well, a very warm welcome to all of you, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and thank you for joining me again for the second of our three Lenten classes on my book, The Gospel of Peace, a commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke from the perspective of nonviolence. So today we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark, and next week we'll finish up talking about Luke. So again, if you'd please mute yourselves and put any questions in the chat, I'll talk for a bit. Hopefully we'll have conversation, and that'll be great. So let's begin with a little prayer. If you'd like to just take a deep breath and maybe close your eyes and relax and notice how you're feeling this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are. And let's all turn to the God of universal love, who loves each one of us, each one of you, infinitely. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus into our hearts and take a moment to give thanks for the blessings of this day and to ask for whatever graces we need for ourselves and our poor world. God of peace, be with us now as we reflect on the Gospel of Mark and the story of the nonviolent Jesus from the perspective of Gandhian Kingian nonviolence. Bless us, strengthen us, heal us, disarm us, give us wisdom and light and grace that we might go forward, renewed, to follow Jesus on the gospel path of nonviolence to the cross and resurrection, that we might do our part as his faithful followers and friends to help end war, poverty, racism, executions, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and all violence, that we too might welcome your reign of universal love and gospel nonviolence. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name. Amen. So welcome again, dear friends, and I'm coming to you from a library somewhere in the middle of California along the coast. And I hope you got my book, The Gospel of Peace, and hope to see a lot of you on the road. You can still get the book at the discount, and please feel free to email me with any comments or questions. I can't guarantee that I can answer everybody, but I can promise, God willing, to read everybody. And you may have received from me an email or from Cassandra containing a whole list of study guide questions. If you want to use them, you're welcome to. I'm not going to use them in this program, but you can take them with you for your future reflection if you want. So the whole point here, just to say it in a nutshell, is that I'm looking at the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, from a Gandhian Kingian hermeneutic of nonviolence. In other words, reading the Gospels from the lens, the perspective of total nonviolence, just as Gandhi and Martin Luther King taught and lived. And when you do that, I said last week when we looked at the Gospel of Matthew, I think they finally make sense. And that's what I've tried to do with the book, is to look at it. But the book is still just the beginning. It's never been done before. And you can run with these stories and this perspective and all the Gospels and go much farther than I have. And then in the whole Bible, and then in life, and in everything you read. And it's really fantastic. So today I want to look at the Gospel of Mark, and I'll just point out a few things that I like. And then I'm sort of presuming you're reading through my book. I realize it's a lot, and that's okay. So a few thoughts just for the record. It's pretty clear that Mark's was the first gospel written. It's the shortest gospel. It has no infancy narrative, for example, no Sermon on the Mount, no long farewell discourse like the Gospel of John, and no resurrection appearance, which is so shocking if you really stop to think about it. And everyone agrees it was the first one written. It's just short and to the point and in your face. Probably the scholars are pretty much in agreement. The year 67 or 68. Why? Well, we know that in the year 70, Rome came in and destroyed Jerusalem, killed everybody. And we pretty much know Luke and Matthew are written shortly after that. Mark not only talks as if, hey, if you don't do my way of nonviolence, the end is going to happen. The scholars think there's so many clues that it actually really was written before that, the destruction. It's very powerful to ponder all of that. And then how Matthew and Luke copy most of Mark. Matthew has like 90% of Mark is in the Gospel of Matthew. And the thing I like to think about, which probably means this is like gospel gossip. I think Mark was written by Peter's oldest son, John Mark. Did any of you read that in my book? I always thought it's so clear because St. Paul refers to John Mark, who's with him. And there's so much stories about how bad Peter was, right? Why would we know all of that unless he told his son, and his son in his community later on, 30 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, the community of Mark, which would have been women and men writing this text, remembered those stories and put them in. But it is also, I think, a reference to Mark himself. As I said before, the Gospels are the only writings without any ego. You don't even know who wrote them, and that's the part of the power. But there's that one verse about the young man in the Garden of Gethsemane who was grabbed but manages to escape. So that would mean to me John Mark, a 17-year-old kid who knew and loved Jesus, was part of the gospel community, Jesus community, a son of Peter, and lived long and told all these stories and witnessed it all, and probably, was friends with Jesus. So those are lovely things to think about. I think if you just take the Gospel of Mark and you say, okay, today I'm going to go and just read the Gospel of Mark, it has an intensity that the others don't have, and a real urgency. And I'm saying all stuff that you all know, and this is just to get us up to speed. But there's no ethereal spiritual treatise. There's no inspiring tale or no teachings, at least at first glance, on mystical prayer or like the great sermon on nonviolence. But there are a few speeches and there are teachings. I submit, and I'm going to talk about this for a few minutes, the thesis, and then I want to look at some stories, that Mark is a call to radical, urgent, nonviolent, direct action, way more than any of the other three Gospels. And that's the key. So it's a record of the deeds of Jesus, which are pure revolution in my mind. And it says, if you want to follow this guy, the nonviolent Jesus, you have to work full time like him, publicly resisting the culture of war, violence, and empire, and in fact, the whole reign of death. And that's the spiritual life. That's a godly life. Steadfast, nonviolent resistance to institutionalized violence in pursuit of God's reign of peace and nonviolence. Do you see my point? And I've noticed that in my notes, I've rewritten that sentence 5 times. So I'm going to keep saying this over and over because I want to make sure we all get it so that I get it. It's written in the present historical tense, also very weird. So, and the word used most often is immediately, 41 times. Very weird. Jesus immediately went to heal the person. Jesus immediately went that way and did that. He's always going. And so the narrative is really fast, and it's supposed to be like that. And it's supposed to keep us on the edge of our seats. Jesus is always on the move, which means he's also always being chased. And so right from the beginning in Mark, Jesus is a target of death threats. He's a target of death from the authorities and others. And so Mark is really a life or death story of resistance and struggle against empire and death itself. So that's why I call the Gospel of Mark a nonstop action thriller of nonviolent resistance. Can I say Mark is like a Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie? No, I better not go there. Okay, so it's a nonstop. We don't have anything like it. except in the life of Gandhi and Dr. King. We don't have any kind of action thriller or of revolutionary nonviolence till the authorities finally catch the guy. And so, to put it another way, and this is what Ched Myers says, Mark, I think I have this as the title of the whole section. Mark is a call to radical discipleship to the nonviolent Jesus in his permanent campaign of nonviolent resistance to the culture of injustice and empire, and therefore, as well as total radical obedience to the God of peace and in citizenship to God's reign of peace. So I think when you read Mark from the Gandhian Kingian perspective of nonviolence, it's pure revolution, but it's a nonviolent revolution. And therefore, it's a call to take up the cross. Mark is really about the cross as nonviolent resistance to war, empire, and death, which means 2,000 years ago, it was a call to take up the cross and resist the Roman Empire. Today, it's a call to take up the cross as nonviolent resistance to America and to whatever country you're coming from. So my thesis is that Mark is calling us to join his campaign of gospel nonviolence, to resist and publicly transform the whole culture and society in every form of injustice, and to welcome God's reign. And wow, is this something we need to hear? As I wrote in one of the e-blasts, and I don't think it's something we even know we want to hear. And I think when we hear it, we don't want to hear it. We wish there was some other message. And, somebody mentioned the questions last week, the Gospel of Thomas, which I didn't answer. But just let me say, I loved Thomas when I first read it 35 years ago, but I've never looked back and read it because there is no cross and way of radical resistance in the Gospel of Thomas. And I'm glad the early church did not include it in the canon. Isn't that interesting? Like, this is not a comfortable gospel. And they put this is the first one. It's really a call to martyrdom, and meaning witness and suffering love. So things like that. It's a call to do what we can today. Now, everything, as I went to great pains in saying in the book, that I've learned about Mark and pretty much about Jesus, I got from Ched Myers. And this is the new version of his classic work. If you want to know more, get this book. It's called Binding the Strong Man, a political reading of Mark's story of Jesus by Ched Myers. This is the new 20th anniversary edition. Hands down the greatest scripture commentary ever written. Came out in mid-'80s. And Darren Berrigan, I was living with him. He spent the whole summer writing this really long introduction, which is a work of art. But it changed Dan and Phil's life. Before, all we had was Karl Barth's commentary on Romans. You think I'm something. This is hard. This is really hard reading. So you read half a page a day for the next 5 years, and you will really grow in discipleship to Jesus. I've read it 4 or 5 times, and it's probably my favorite book. So Ched argues, and we'll return to this, that the only way Mark makes sense is through orthopraxis. In other words, not orthodoxy. There's no dogma here. What's scarier is there's orthopraxis. You have to take action. You have to do something. The story, Mark, doesn't make sense unless you are doing something in your life. Isn't that amazing? And you know what we mean. And all of this came out of liberation theology. You can't think your way into action. You act your way into a new way of thinking. And you act your way into understanding the gospel. You can read the gospel, you can hear the gospel preached, but it will make no sense unless you are engaged in public action for justice and peace. Well, that's the literal conclusion of the Gospel of Mark. So I'll return to that, but I invite you to ponder that. And if that's true, then the challenge of looking at Mark here in Lent means, I think the fundamental question for all of us here on the Zoom or listening to this is, what new step are we going to take for justice and peace in response to the Gospel of Mark? More than the other Gospels, Mark demands a response from the disciple and the reader. And it's brilliantly explained by Ched, and you can see it much clearer when you see how Ched keeps pointing it out. Because Mark is going, see, the disciples didn't understand. But as Ched says, that means you, the reader, don't understand either. But if you follow him and do this, you'll begin to understand. So I invite you to reflect on taking some new action. So I want to walk through my favorite points in Mark. And I don't know, I might have 7 or 8 of them, and they're all in the book. And I might be able to get through these and I might not. So here goes, buckled your seatbelt, go get a cup of coffee, David, or at least some food or something stronger. I'm trying to make David laugh, but it's not working there, David Hoover. Okay, the first sentence, Mark throws down the gauntlet. This is what's such a thrilling thing. And we've heard it a million times, it doesn't mean anything. The beginning of the gospel according to Jesus. Total in-your-face political revolution, because only the Roman Empire used the word gospel. That's what was used to announce the latest war victory by the Roman Empire. Hey, good news! We've had another victory for Caesar. We went and killed everybody in the next town over and stole all their stuff. And the survivors, the men, are now soldiers for Rome. Join us in celebrating the gospel of Caesar. No, excuse us. We are announcing the beginning of the gospel of Mark. So, I mean, what? You could be killed reading this gospel. Certainly killed for writing the gospel. I mean, this is so political when you begin to understand it like this. And I find that very hopeful, because we've lost all of that. And when you begin to really ponder the meaning of the gospel word, then you realize that we're inundated with the gospel of America, especially with the election coming around the corner. And it's actually an anti-gospel. And so we could reflect at length about that. The very first time I met Daniel Berrigan 40 years ago, he was my teacher. It was at the Kirkridge Retreat Center. He stood up and opened the Bible. Here's my Bible. Abolish nuclear weapons. That's what my Bible says. And he turned to chapter 3 of the Gospel of Mark and read the first verse and the verses that followed. And I remember telling him afterwards, I'd never heard anybody talk like that in my whole life, and I don't think I ever have since. So that's why I want to start with that story, because it means so much to me personally and to Dan. And who the heck cares about this story? It just says Jesus walked into the synagogue in the little village of Capernaum. Okay, he's going to read the scripture and preach. And there's what, 50 men there? And he sees in the back of the room a poor guy with a withered hand, right? And he stops the proceedings. He doesn't read from the Holy Scriptures. He doesn't preach. He calls the poor guy to come up. It's very dramatic. And stand up front, in the front of everybody. And the tension is building. And then Jesus doesn't heal him. Well, I've read that 100 times. This is what Daniel Berrigan said. And I went, what? Because Dan was unpacking the story as Gandhian, Kingian, dramatic, nonviolent civil disobedience, which is the way what Gandhi and King did. So there's a room full of these really mean, tough, powerful religious authorities. They see the guy with the withered hand up front. And they're looking at Jesus. What are you going to do? We're going to catch you because it's the Sabbath. You're not allowed to do anything. and Jesus asks a question. And Dan went and talked about this question for 45 minutes. And we were dumbfounded. You know the question. Is it legal to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? To save life or destroy life? Huh? Who's talking about destroying life or doing evil? We're here in the synagogue. We're reading the Holy Scriptures. Can you imagine, for those of us who are Catholics, stopping Mass and saying, is it legal to do good on Sunday at Mass or evil, or to save life or destroy life? What are you talking about? We're here. Jesus cannot continue while there's an oppressed, suffering, marginalized person in the synagogue. Powerful. That's how in your face Jesus is. And Dan said, I still have the notes from that day. I should have brought them. I'm in the library again. But he said, I memorized a lot of it. I can quote it to you. Jesus says all the wrong things to the wrong people in the wrong places at the wrong time. What Jesus is calling us to is to confront and break our addiction to death as a social methodology. That's what Dan said while reading Mark 3. I invite us to go and sit with that question of Jesus. And how does it apply to our lives? It doesn't apply to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes there, or those poor people in Capernaum, does it? For Jesus, it does. It's the question, Dan said. So they refuse to answer it, and Jesus commands the poor guy, stretch out your hand. He does, and the next sentence is, and so they immediately took counsel on how to kill Jesus, to assassinate him over this. So this to me was one of the greatest teaching moments in my own life, and I invite all of you to sit with it. By the way, what I have not quoted in the story was this in the sentence is the only place in the Synoptic Gospels where it says Jesus is angry. And it says, and looking at them with anger, Jesus said to the man, stretch out your hand. In Matthew last week, we heard in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus forbid us to have any anger. And then I was pitching that, in fact, he wasn't an angry person, he was grieving. I submit that's the wrong translation from the Greek. It's a word that appears only one other time in John 11, in the raising of Lazarus. And it's about your stomach. And it's like this 10-mile long word. And it says, Jesus was so upset that he was sick to his stomach, which I think might actually be different than anger, but it's definitely not anger. So I wanted to point that out, and that's the only time the word is used in the synoptics. He's grieving their hardness of heart, we're told. So that's a great story to sit with. And then let me look at the sea crossings, which I mentioned last week. There's 2 in Mark, and Ched is the one who really put this out. Jesus says several times, okay, let us cross to the other side. What? Do we have to? It means we're going to Iraq. We're going to Palestine. We're going to Gaza tonight. Drop everything. And just imagine that. I talk this way because our friend Kathy Kelly called me, I don't know, 10 years ago and said, John, I need you to go to Afghanistan next week and be part of this thing that's going to happen there with some Nobel Peace Prize winners. And I was in Wyoming when she called me, and I said, okay. And I went. Totally wild. That's what this is about. Going to the other side is to go into scary enemy war zone territory occupied by the Roman Empire. It could be what Mark calls the Gerasene district or the Gadara district. There's different names for it, and no one really knows. So the disciples get in the boat. Jesus is in the boat. I'm laughing because they're out there. It's a nonviolent action into enemy territory, right? I mean, nobody's supposed to do this. And they're really scared, and he's practicing nonviolence, and he's teaching the disciples, and therefore us, how to practice and take nonviolent direct action, even to love our enemies and to reconcile both sides of the sea. And in the first one, it says a violent squall came up. I don't know if you ever seen a squall. I certainly know them from growing up in Nags Head, North Carolina on the beach. You know, it's just like this tornado that can come right up to the ocean, to the beach, and destroy hotels. Very scary, a tornado of the ocean. And a squall was in the Sea of Galilee. And once I was on the Sea of Galilee and there was a terrible storm. And it's kind of scary. It was big enough sea to be scary. Jesus, Mark describes as sound asleep on a cushion, the poor guy, finally getting some sleep. He's not scared at all. They're scared to death, terrified. They finally wake him up. And whereas Jesus, you know, practicing love your enemies and nonviolence is like as easy as taking a nap. You know, you can get up, caught up on some much needed sleep. And so we get these teachings. Do you not care that we are perishing? They wake him up. He turns to the sea. Quiet, be still. And then he turns to them, and we get more questions. Why are you terrified? Do you not yet have faith? If you're interested in nonviolence, those are the questions to sit with. Where are you in the boat? How are you terrified when you engaged in nonviolence, like the disciples? How is Jesus saying to you, you know, why are you still so afraid? And don't you have any faith? So we're talking about here faith, not fear. And Gandhi then concluding, having read these Gospels, that the only way to practice nonviolence is to cultivate, and he professed a vow of this, what he called fearlessness. And that's where you and I are headed. And that's a very great theme of Mark. To do that, you have to be totally surrendered to God. Even when all hell or the storm is breaking around you, it's like you can sleep on a cushion in the middle of a hurricane. I kid you not. No, that's an image of the faith that Jesus has. Jesus is fine, and we'll be fine too if we trust in God. And the way I've been thinking about this antidote to fear, this radical, fearless faith, I've been calling it total reliance on God, or total surrender to God. Now, there's another story about the sea, but I'm already gone way too long. But here goes. One of my favorite passages that I've never heard anybody ever talk about. And I've been talking about it for 40 years, ever since I read Ched. I'm giving retreats on this passage, and people look at me and shake their heads and go, wow, this is awful. Like, there's no feel-good stuff in this. You know, it's not like reading Shantideva or Pema Chodron or Rumi. This is go and change the world. They get to the other side. So the man with the withered hand is chapter 3. Jesus in the boat with the squall is Mark chapter 4. Now we're at chapter 5, verse 1. They land in enemy territory. And immediately there's a bunch of tombs there. That's the grave site. You cannot get more evil and unclean for a holy rabbi than the tombs, right? Think about, this is illegal to even go near. And a man is walking around in the tombs, and we're given all these descriptions about him. He's possessed by death. It says he lives in the tombs. No one can restrain him. He can't even be held down by a chain. Who would want to put a chain on him? He pulls apart his chains and his shackles. No one is strong enough to subdue him. Later, Mark will have Jesus describe himself as, I am the strong man who is binding the strong man. I'm actually the stronger man binding the strong man. It's so rich. The man cries out day and night, and he bruises and cuts himself with rocks. Those are all images of death and oppression and occupation. And it's a really quite horrific image if you can sit with it and try to see imagine the scene of violence. The man is out of his mind. whereas Jesus is the only person in his right mind because he's full of the Holy Spirit. And you and I are talking about putting on the mind of the nonviolent Jesus. And notice, Jesus is not scared one bit. He just had a good nap. And he gets out of the boat and he's talking to the man. Nobody, everybody else is running from him. Jesus is, we're told, like 7 verses in, he had been saying to the man, unclean spirit, come out of him. So Jesus is approaching the guy and ordering the unclean spirit, the spirit of death and violence, to leave him. Friends, if you want to follow Jesus, this is what you have to do. This is part of our ministry. We order the unclean spirits of death and destruction, of nationalism and war, people being possessed by what? The NRA, gun violence, bombing and killing in whatever war you like, and we just order people, those spirits, to come out of them and to be free of it. That's part of the work of discipleship that Mark presents so clearly. But the story goes on, and we how shall I put this? Well, let's go this way. The man with the unclean spirit cries out, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I beg you, by God, do not torment me." So he's saying, Jesus, don't kill me. Don't do violence to me. The man is possessed with violence and trying to kill himself. He keeps striking himself. All he knows is violence and death. So he's presuming that's what Jesus is bringing, whereas Jesus is perfect nonviolence. And Jesus is the embodiment of nonviolence. He comes up to the man and he engages him, and he treats him like a human being. And he doesn't yell at him, or he says, "What is your name?" So, I mean, you could say this is just all a great parable, friends. Legion is my name. There are many of us. And now we know what the parable means. Legion is a Roman unit of 2,000 Roman soldiers. Everybody knows that. It's in Josephus, the Roman historian. So now, after all these verses, we realize Jesus forced the disciples to go to an occupied territory where there were 2,000 Roman soldiers who have controlled this whole region, symbolized by a guy who's destroyed it with death. Think Gaza and in Israel. Think Russia and Ukraine. This is a parable of that. Legion, it couldn't be more political. He can't come right out and say it's the Roman Empire. So we use these code languages. So it's a story about not just the Roman occupation, but Jesus's fearless public nonviolence confronting imperial occupation and war. And he tells the genius of I don't know, Mark and or Jesus. Mark's Jesus, and Jesus orders the legion to go into the herd who rush off the cliff. Well, the herd of 2,000 pigs rush off the cliff and die. So the crowds see the man now completely free, not possessed, sitting there clothed and in his right mind. They're totally terrified, beg Jesus to leave, and they go and tell people what happened. Jesus, in healing the man, has liberated the entire region from Roman military occupation, but it comes with a price. Those people like being occupied because you get to kill and sell those 2,000 pigs and make money for the heathen Romans who need food to eat. There's an economic price here. It's brilliant. But we don't want to pay that because then they're poor and they don't have a livelihood. They're not going to be rich because they don't have the swine is gone. So they get rid of this guy. I mean, it's rich on an infinite bunch of layers, politically, militarily, economically, humanly, psychologically. And of course, it's all about discipleship. And the man, it's so touching at the end, begs to remain with Jesus. And Jesus says, go back to your family, which we don't have time to talk about, but wow. and announce everything that God in his compassion has done for you. In other words, Jesus is restoring those who are excluded, marginalized. The family has kicked him out. He's in the zone of death in the tombs. Jesus is restoring all those excluded to their community. He reconciles everybody. And it says the man went off and proclaimed the kingdom of God everywhere, which I always liked because it showed that Jesus' nonviolent direct action, even though they kicked Jesus out and it looks like it fails, it actually, nonviolence always works. He healed the man. He kicked out the Roman Empire, and his message was proclaimed to the whole region. Another good day done, good work done, and he got a good nap in the process. So they get in a boat to go back. Now, I just love that story. And that's what you and I have to do. And I used to give this reflections on this when we went up to Los Alamos, which is the little place up in the mountains near Santa Fe, New Mexico. You saw the Oppenheimer movie where they build all the nuclear weapons. It is a land possessed by imperialism, death, nuclear weapons, war, greed, killing. And if we got rid of nuclear weapons, all those people would be poor. And they don't want it. It's exactly like this story. And that's a reason why no one talks about the Gerasene demoniac. But you see that Jesus is a man of action who takes risks, and he does so publicly. So he speaks out publicly and he sides with the ones most excluded, the poorest of the poor, the enemy. And it's always daring, creative, bold, in-your-face nonviolence. And in doing so, he, is proclaiming the reign of God, and he is the presence of God. And he's telling the disciples, now follow me and go and do the same. And by the way, it's not going to work for me and it's not going to work for you. So what I want to do next, if you're still with me, I just have a couple of little other stories I want to talk about. This is one I've been talking about for 40 years too, because it has meant so much to me. The way Mark writes, and you find it also in Matthew and Luke, it's called sandwiching. Do you all know this? I hope you all know it. ABA. Remember your Shakespeare iambic pentameter. Well, this is not that. This is much cooler than Shakespeare. A, he tells you something. B, there's a lesson. A, we go back to the original thing and now we understand it. Isn't that great? Do you see the point? So that is the way it's used. So for example, last week we were looking at the fig tree, or someone asked me about it. It says in Mark, Jesus walked by, saw the fig tree, there was no fruit on it. This is Mark's version, and he cursed it. B, he went into the temple and turned over the tables in nonviolent civil disobedience. A, he leaves the temple. Go back and look this up. I may even bring it back up. I keep hitting the table here and pounding on it. Sorry about that, but I get too excited. Plus, everybody in the library is looking at me through the window here. Forgot what I was saying. So, A, the fig tree. B, he does the civil disobedience. A, he comes back. They see the fig tree and say, wow, look at the fig tree that you cursed. It's dead. And then we have the punchline. Remind me to tell you the punchline. Now I want to look at the most famous of all the ABAs. Mark paints the two total extreme examples of discipleship. David and Sharon, you probably heard this from Ched 40 years ago. The rich person and the poorest person. And then we have a teaching in the middle with the disciples. And it's just so spectacular. So first we get the rich man. Later you'll see in Luke, maybe he's a rich young man. Sometimes he's called an official. And so here goes, and I just want to point out a few things. Jesus is on the way. He's walking, he's leading his campaign. He's got the disciples behind them. And the rich landowner, we'll learn at the end of the story, he interrupts Jesus. Right there, that always kills me. Don't do that, folks. You don't, he just marches in front of Jesus, kneels down before him, and does civil disobedience to Jesus. Do you see that? Jesus is he's got a campaign. You don't do that to Gandhi or Dr. King, and you don't do it to our God. And that's shocking. And that's the way we are, all of us. Overprivileged, entitled, demanding, hey, and what does he say? Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What a horrible question. Everything about the question is wrong. I think I wrote about all this in the book, but I love it. And I've been praying over this for 40 years. Jesus is not a good teacher. That's why he says in somewhere, why do you call me good? Jesus is Lord, Master, God, the Holy Christ, the Anointed One. And you be careful. He's just trying to flatter poor Jesus. But the focus is always on ourselves. We're all narcissists and egocentric. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Because it's mine and I'm in charge. And just give me a little advice because it's mine and I will do it. Baloney, baloney, baloney. Never talk to God like that ever again. Everything about what this guy is saying to Jesus is wrong. And that he's really, the story is trying to teach the disciples and the reader, and nobody gets it. He thinks he deserves it. I'm going to inherit eternal life. I mean, just like I inherited my 10,000 acres and all my slaves. That's what's going on here. It's a basic right. No one is good but God alone, Jesus says. And then the guy says, well, what are the commandments? And have you kept these commandments? I don't have the text in front of me, but you know the story, right? Jesus names like 6 of them. Honor your father and mother. Love the Lord your God. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not defraud. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's good. Yeah, I've done all of those, the guy said. Genius. One of them is not one of the 10 commandments. Do you all remember this? Does everybody know this story? I hope you all know this story. That's a yes. So I'll just cut it short. I think that's brilliant that Jesus adds, do not defraud, which means you shall not deceive people to deprive them of their wealth and possessions. That's the whole point of being rich, is you defraud people to get more money. That's the very definition of being a landowner and a rich person. Deception. Because who owns the land as far as Jesus is concerned? The man says he's observed all of these, and it says Jesus looked on the man with agape. So there we have Jesus loving his enemy. He knows well the man has not obeyed these commandments, but Jesus loves him anyway. You are lacking in one thing. Go, sell what you have, give to the poor, and you have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. Those are the teachings. Go, sell what you have, give it all to the poor. Follow me, and you will have the fullness of life. And the man goes away sad, and that's the punchline. We're told he had many possessions, which meant apparently in the Greek, he had large pieces of property. So he's a landowner, and that's not good. So wealth and land ownership have spiritual consequences. So I'm not going to go through the B, but the B is where James and John come up to him and say, hey, well, what about us? We want to sit at your right and your left. And it gets again with the ego. And then Jesus says, well, can you drink the cup? And they say, actually, we can. And then he goes, great. Well, I can't give you my right and my left. That's only God does. We'll know at the end of the story who gets the right and the left side of Jesus. Right? You know who does? The violent revolutionaries who are killed also on the cross, one on his left, one on his right. Jesus signs sides with, he lets himself be misunderstood by being on the side of standing against empire, even though he's a total nonviolent revolutionary. It's shocking. So instead we get this other extreme example who's given a name, the blind beggar Bartimaeus, who's sitting by the road. He's calling out, so he can't disrupt Jesus, but he calls out, Jesus, son of David, have pity on me. So right there, it'd be like, hey, Jesus, you're one of the Kennedys. You're like Thomas Jefferson, or I don't know, King Louis, or Alexander the Great. I mean, this is high praise. Son of David, have mercy on me, a nobody. And the disciples tell the guy to shut up, which just kills me because they're so clueless, which is what we do too. Hey, don't bother the Holy One. Don't you see he's processing along? No, I'm blind. I don't see. And he keeps calling out longer. And then Jesus says, bring him to me. And the disciples say to the blind guy, hey, take courage. He's calling you. They're mocking Jesus, who in the storm at sea says, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Have you no faith? So they're acting like that to the poor guy. The poor guy has tons of courage, whereas these disciples don't. It's so interesting. I love all this, how it all gets mixed up and they're clueless. And this is what I love about the story, this little tiny detail. He threw aside his cloak, sprang up, and came to Jesus. So we think about that. He's a homeless beggar who's blind, sitting by the dirt road outside of the big city of Jericho. What's he doing? He's begging for alms. That cloak is his entire life's savings, all the money he has in the entire world. Jesus says, come. He throws away all the money he has and runs after Jesus. The genius of this gospel and the contrast with the rich man who walks away sad. And then Jesus just basically gives himself to the blind person. What do you want me to do for you? What do you want? It's not what I want, and it's not the blind man. It's not, I want this. It's you, Jesus, have mercy on me. Okay, then Jesus can say, what do you want me to do? Whereas the other guy is, I deserve this, and Jesus can't. Well, he doesn't need Jesus. He's got his money and probably his weapons. So he doesn't need Jesus. The poor blind beggar needs Jesus. And if you need Jesus, if you go like a beggar, which is the only way to live, Bartimaeus is the greatest disciple in Mark, then you just say, Son of David, Son of God. It's like saying Son of Gandhi, Son of King, Son of Dorothy Day, have mercy on me. And Jesus will give himself to us. And he says, Master, I want to see. That's what Jesus can give. Go your way. Your faith has saved you. And it said the blind man followed Jesus on the way. He's now a disciple. It's such a rich image of radical discipleship, which is what the call is. There's so many things to explore, but just the thing about vision, which I've always loved, that Bartimaeus asked for vision. Nobody else asked for visions. The disciples think they can see. And only later will John pick this up and has the verse in chapter 9. Jesus walked by and saw humanity born blind from birth. So no one can see except for Jesus, but Jesus can give vision because he's the only nonviolent person there is. We're all blinded by violence and wealth and ego and Jesus isn't, so he's happy to follow Jesus on the way. I want to end with Mark 13. Well, I guess I'll just mention the fig tree in Mark 11. It's that ABA thing again, which Mark uses over and over again. After the civil disobedience, the fig tree comes back up, and they say, "Look, it's dead." And you read the famous sentences. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Just have faith, and say to this mountain, get up and be thrown to the sea, and it will happen if you have faith." So ask in prayer and believe it, and you'll get what you've asked for. And every time you pray, forgive everyone who ever hurt you. Friends, those are some of the most radical 4 teachings in the entire 4 Gospels, and we've heard it so often we don't get it. He has just done civil disobedience in the temple. The belief is that God, the only place God is in on the whole planet is in that building. And you got to pay your money to get in. He's not in you and me. He's not in the poor. He's not in nature. He's not in scripture. He's in the temple. Jesus has turned over the tables, cursed the fig tree. The fig tree, Israel, is now dead. And Mark's Jesus says, you don't have to go to the temple anymore. Just believe wherever you are. Believe totally in God. And every time you pray to God, every single day, every time you pray, always say, and by the way, I forgive everyone who ever hurt me. I go and look it up, Mark 11:20, and ask and believe that what you say will happen. So when he says, say to this mountain, it's like saying, I order the end of apartheid in the name of God. Now, I saw Tutu do that, and it happened. Be thrown into the sea. That's what we're talking about. It's movement language. That's impossible. You can't move a mountain. You can't end apartheid. You can't end the war in Gaza. You can't end the executions. You can't end nuclear weapons. Yes, you can. If you believe and organize and act and ask, that's the message of Mark. Now, what I wanted to share with you, and it's not in the book, is that I was typing Mark 13 one day 2 years ago, and I heard on the radio, Russia has just invaded Ukraine. And for the first time, I understood Mark 13. Have some of you heard me talk about this? Maybe not. So this is the very end of the gospel. It's just before Jesus is arrested and executed, which is the end of the gospel. And go and read it. It's very weird. He's sitting in the Mount of Olives. He's looking at Jerusalem. And Mark says, he tells Peter, James, and John and Andrew, keep watch, keep watch, keep watch, keep watch. Be vigilant, stay alert, keep watch. He says it 5, 6, 7 times. What the heck is he talking about? I call it the Sermon on Eschatological Nonviolence in a Time of Apocalyptic Violence. I'm trying to impress you, and it's not working at all. Maybe it's way too late. I'm trying to make you laugh, and that's not working either. So he's saying, keep watch with me. We are contemplatives of nonviolence, okay? If you guys really follow me, every single person everywhere is going to hate you. Makes perfect sense. If you are a person of total nonviolence like me, Jesus is saying, and you live in contemplative nonviolence, you're on permanent watch for God, with God, while we're here on earth. You are against every war, all violence, all killing on all sides, and everyone hates you. See, remember, the Romans have not come in, but there's dozens of violent military groups, not just the zealots, trying to kill the Romans. And it's inevitable with all these violent revolution and killing going on in the city that they're looking at, that Rome is going to come in and destroy them. In other words, it's like you're against the Russian invasion on Ukraine, right? You're against the violence of Ukrainians in response to killing young Russian soldiers, and you support the nonviolent Ukrainian peace movement, right? You're against NATO and all their 25 years of egging on this war, right? You're against the United States, which has given military aid to all sides in every wars, right? You're against Hamas, you're against Israel, you're against the United States military aid, you're against all sides in every wars, and you practice total non-alignment. Now, this is what Thich Nhat Hanh did. And he had to flee Vietnam because not only did the North Vietnamese want to kill him, the people in South Vietnam wanted to kill him, and the Americans wanted to kill him. And he had to live in France the rest of his life. He had no home. That's the nonviolence of Mark 13. I invite you to ponder that. And then the empire arrests Jesus and kills him, as you know, and there's no resurrection. We just have those mysterious 8 verses. Of course, Mark emphasizes that the women are the faithful ones, and I hope I emphasize that in the book. The women are always there in Mark, and in Mark, the male disciples always fail. They never get it. They don't ever get it. They never get it. The women get it. And he emphasizes it so much that they're even at the tomb. They meet the angel, says, who are you looking for? He's not here, he's living, but go tell the disciples to meet him where you first met him, back in Galilee. And it says they ran away terrified. And that's where the text actually ends. The rest was added 700 years later. So then you read Ched Myers, who brilliantly said, Mark knew what he was doing in saying that. Such genius. If you want to meet the risen Jesus, you disciples and you, dear readers, have to go back to where the story began, and you have to take up the journey of radical discipleship, and then you will meet the risen Jesus along the way. That's why the Gospel of Mark was a call to radical discipleship to the nonviolent Jesus in resistance to the culture of violence and obedience to the gospel of, to the God of peace. Well, I hope that was helpful. Thank you for your patience. I know I've gone on and on. Let's see. It looks like there's only 2 comments or questions. Chris Furlong, your first one about is patriarchy violent? Well, I would think it would have to be. The answer is yes. That's what your question is. So what we're seeing in this story is kind of beyond patriarchy and hierarchy. It's slavery, because women were considered slaves of men 2,000 years ago. We're not actually equal, fully human beings compared to men. That was the thinking then, or the lack of thinking. But yeah, so, what is nonviolence? Nonviolence would mean total equality among all human beings. Okay, that means women and men. Great. Ched in my book puts children a lot. Ched's Mark's Jesus inserts children into that equation because children are even lower and worse than women. And there's 3 or 4 extraordinary examples of Jesus. So Jesus is siding with women unbelievably and doing all the wrong things. And he's also doing that with children and putting children in the center, which really would have pissed off the male disciples. This is so political. And, I put it in my book. Ched goes into great length with scholarship and citations and Greek to explain that. So we're working for a world of equality beyond even what we can even imagine, and then equality and nonviolence toward the creatures and all of creation. So then, John, you have a question about my friend, Father Michael Lapsley. He describes a forgiveness that has requirements in order to be full forgiveness. This makes sense in a psychological health framework, but in light of Jesus's 70 times 7, and if you're at the altar, drop your gift and go to your brother. I stand conflicted. That's good, John. Where are you? Can you wave so I can see where you are? I'm going to look around for you. Oh, there you are. Yeah, I think if you understand everything, and don't think that I do, if you're not conflicted by this, we're not even beginning to scratch the surface. Oh, yeah, this is really tough stuff. And I know Michael. I spent a day with him at his house, so he's my friend, and he wouldn't mind me saying any of this. And he knows all my work on nonviolence and loves it. And the same with Tutu. And they wouldn't agree with me 100%. But everything Michael is talking about, which would be justice, or restorative justice, a justice you don't punish someone or kill someone, you heal them and return them to society. And South Africa has invented that with the Truth and Reconciliation question. Everything Michael would want is in the Gospel of Mark, but it's especially in Matthew 18, where there's 4 or 5 conditions on how to bring a person who has committed such public sin that they have to be excluded from the community. And if they do this, you bring them back to the community. First of all, you send somebody in the community, and then you send an elder to the community. Then you bring them to the whole community. I mean, even Jesus is teaching that's the restorative justice. But it's all there, John. However, I was emphasizing this verse because you think, well, okay, you're telling me Mark is just nonviolent resistance over and over and over again? Yeah. He does civil disobedience, yeah. And you'd think he'd be making a big political speech. Instead, he says, have faith. And that goes right over our heads. But if it's in the context that you don't have to go and spend all your money to go in and buy a dove or a lamb to worship God, you can even be in the poorest person on the planet. And if you believe in God, God is with you and you can move mountains. That's what Mother Teresa's life shows us. In the worst place on the planet, in Calcutta, she was moving mountains, that kind of thing. And Martin Luther King from the South, moving mountains. But it's very strange that there, he says, however, just be sure every time you stand to pray, the word stand is used, forgive. And if you don't forgive, how can you expect to be forgiven? Which is a regular teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. That's the lovely thoughts. Okay, so if you have a question, raise your hand, and I will call on you. And because I don't see any other comments in the chat, maybe we've resolved everything. Let me go first to Cheryl, and then I'll come to you, Frank. Cheryl, go ahead and unmute yourself, and then you, Lizanne. Don't let me forget you,
Yeah.
Lizanne. Hi, Cheryl.
I saw Lizanne's hand before mine, so I hope you don't mind. I'll just go ahead. Hi, John. Could you just talk for a few minutes in this context about Aaron Bushnell, Presente?
Yeah. Well, so do you want to just tell everybody briefly, in a sense, about him so everybody knows who you're talking about? And remember, this is all being recorded.
Yes, on Sunday, a young 25-year-old Air Force active duty soldier set himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington to protest genocide. And it's just heartbreaking and amazing. And I think the gospel, all this applies, but I would like you to talk about that, John, because I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm just grieving, like you, Cheryl, for everyone on the planet who is killing and being killed and suffering and dying, which is every human being. And Trump is so lost, he doesn't even know it. And no, none of the powerful do. They're so lost. They don't know it. So we're all grieving, grieving, grieving. The gospel is very clear. I think I talked about that last week. We're going to talk about it more next week in Luke, because Luke really ups the ante and ends with grief, the lamentation over Jerusalem. If you had only known the things that make for peace. So Jesus is about grief, and that's when you and I give up, Cheryl. But when you see Luke next week, he breaks down sobbing when he sees Jerusalem. There's no hope. You've rejected me. You've rejected nonviolence. And you and I give up. Jesus takes action. He does two dramatic, nonviolent actions that cost his life. The first, he gets on a donkey and rides into the old Jerusalem in an act of political street theater. While the emperor's representative Pilate is riding in on the war horse with 600 soldiers, Jesus rides in on a donkey. And then he goes right to the temple and does civil disobedience, and they kill him within 24 hours. He's saying no more injustice. So this is the person that Jesus is, and the life we're called to imitate. And so I know a lot about these unfortunate, sad stories through my friendship with Dan, because Dan Berrigan, of course, was dealing with this in the 1960s through his friends. So Dan, as you know, one of the young Catholic workers immolated themselves in front of the United Nations, Roger Laporte, in 1965. And Dan was kicked out of New York City indefinitely. He was thrown to Latin America. It was front page of the New York Times because he said mass and prayed for Roger Laporte at the Catholic Worker with Dorothy Day. It was a private mass. It wasn't a public thing. And I published his homily in my book, but he didn't condone the act. But what everybody was mad was, he was saying, well, we can't say this is suicide. We're going to be on the verge of killing 1 million people. And we're praying. We're people of prayer and blessing and nonviolence. And that's not our gospel way, but we're grieving for our brother. Dan knew Roger Laporte. Thich Nhat Hanh knew many people who immolated themselves, including the famous one, and told me some about it. I just don't think that is, how do I put this? That's the way of Jesus's teaching. Now, there's not passivity, though. The action of Jesus is going to get you killed. I mean, that's what the gospel is. Take up your cross. So it's through nonviolence. That's why I wrote so much in my book, Cheryl, that nonviolence means being totally nonviolent to yourself. Jesus is. Number 2, totally nonviolent toward every human being and creatures and creation. Jesus is. And 3, being part of the grassroots movement through active nonviolence to resist and change, because that's the way Jesus lives. That's the way of the disciple. I wish I could have talked to young Aaron. And Cheryl, I have talked to many, many young Aarons and invited them to quit the military and join the movement. I did this weekend in Los Angeles. I was talking to some young people. And so those are some thoughts. So there's no judgment, there's no condemnation, there's prayer, there's grief, and there's going forward to use creative nonviolence to end U.S. military aid to Israel and do what we can to help end this war and keep calling for a ceasefire and the end of all wars, all wars. And that's why I'm teaching nonviolence. I could go on and on. Those are some thoughts. Thank you so much for asking that, Cheryl. Frank, let's go to you next. You had a comment or question. I hope this is okay, folks. And Cheryl, these are just my little 2 cents. What do I know? Okay, Frank, go ahead, wherever you are.
Thank you, Father. And this has just been a powerful session. And just wanted to thank you again. You had mentioned the last time about your book on Amazon and the rating of it. And I just wanted to mention to everybody, as you did last week, that if people go on, rate your book, write a review, it will keep your book up to the top and will help you get your message across. So I think it will really help, and it's got to get out there. And I would advise everybody who can do it to write a recommendation or a rating for you.
Gee, Frank, thanks so much for giving my book a little plug. Frank wrote to me that he did this. And if you know Amazon, it's really the majority way of books getting across in North America, unfortunately, these days. And so my book is ranked number 80,000. And it's in commentaries, it's like number 300. But most of my friends, like Jim Wallace does this, he organizes when the book comes out. He has 500 people write a review that first day, and the book goes to number 1. So everything is organizing. Well, I wasn't able to do that, but it would help if everyone wrote a little review and just take you 2 or 3 minutes, and you can see Frank's there. That would really help me and try to get the message of gospel nonviolence out there. So thanks, Frank. Okay, Lizanne, this is it. You're up. Thank you for patience.
Thank you. Now be gentle with me. I asked you a question last week about self-defense. And you go,
That's great.
and I want to apply that to, and I'm losing my train of thought here. first of all, I want to say how much I appreciate your teachings. I mean, I'm sort of new to this, even though to your teachings about nonviolence, and it absolutely amazes me how many sermons I've listened to on all these Bible stories, and I'm actually have taken an in-depth study of the Gospel of Mark, and not once did this theme of nonviolence come up. So it's so important your work. So thank you so much for that, because I've never heard anybody read the gospel that way. And anyway, what I wanted to ask you was,
Well, let me just say, Lizanne, thank you. But you can tell me I'm wrong, because sometimes I think, God, I must be crazy. I'm the only one, I feel like, sometimes saying this
didn't
stuff
mean
in the
that.
world even.
What did you say?
I
No.
feel like, no, there's, I was talking about this when I saw Richard Rohr a week or two ago, like, am I right? Am I wrong? Dr. King didn't say this. I'm saying this, and that's why I'm pointing to my resources. I didn't put footnotes in my book because there are no places to take footnotes from,
Well, no,
except the Greek,
that's
and
my
you just read it.
info.
Oh, anyway, so you can say, no, I'm wrong. Lizanne.
Point.
That's all I'm
What
saying.
I'm saying is you're bringing something totally, I think, at least, I mean, I haven't had that much experience, but I've heard a lot of sermons. What I'm saying is you're like the Spirit is at work here. I see you as bringing a new message to these stories that people haven't. I mean, I think I'm trying to compliment you and saying how much it means to me to hear your take on these stories, because in our world, it's so important.
Yeah.
It's
Thank you.
so important on violence. And I think, the Bible is a living work. And you're bringing at least to me, you're bringing a new reading to it. I haven't been one of the people that have been following you for years and years and years. I'm new to this, and I'm so glad that I signed up for it. So thank you. I'm thanking you for doing your work. It's so important.
You're welcome.
And the reason anyway, to apply my question last week that I asked about personal self-defense, and you said something about, like, you're against Russia invading your Ukraine. You're against, not just you, but nonviolence means, like, what? I'm sorry. I'm getting all excited, so I'm having trouble expressing myself. The question that entered my mind was when you talked about Russia invading Ukraine, and of course Israel and Gaza. What if Ukraine was a Christian country? What should their response be? Do you know what I mean? Like, to being invaded, it's sort of like a much bigger picture and maybe that's an inappropriate question.
No, that's the question. So let me respond. Let me tell you that there are thousands and thousands of Ukrainians who are against killing Russians, who practice active, steadfast, nonviolent resistance to Russian occupation. And nobody is reporting that in the United States. Why? Because the media makes a lot of money by reporting on war. The government makes a lot of money and keeps its whole thing going by reporting on war, because they kind of work for the weapons manufacturers and the oil companies. So when the war started that week, Amy Goodman, my friend who has the show Democracy Now!, she brought on the head of the Ukrainian movement of nonviolence live. And you can go and watch his 1-hour interview. And he says, don't send us weapons. Don't fund the war. Fund the nonviolent resistance. Wherever that is done in history, it works. I lived in Northern Ireland in the last year of the Troubles. I didn't plan it that way. It happened. The day I arrived, I ended up having lunch with Jerry Adams, head of the IRA.
Isn't that
I
interesting?
saw,
Yeah.
no, I saw the war end with the Good Friday Agreement because the US and Britain funded peace movement. It always works. There's way more money for the US to be made if you just keep war going.
Right.
And that's what's going on here. And it's all about NATO, which I tried to express from the Pope's getting in a lot of trouble for not immediately condemning Putin. And you can understand what he was doing. He's saying NATO has been egging on the US was wanted this war for 25 years. This war did not happen overnight. It's been 25 years in the making, as is the Gaza war, as are all the wars. The US is planning them. They got millions of people working on war. The majority of the economy is about war and killing people. We're talking about, all of us therefore live in the district of the Gerasenes. We're all occupied and we don't even know it. So I was trying to say, well, it's not self-defense, Lizanne. It's violent self-defense or non-violent self-defense.
Right.
And remember that with everything from now on. Everything you think about, every question, anything that comes up, is that violent or non-violent? And you say, I'm suggesting that Jesus is inviting us to choose the non-violent response. There's always, 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 always a non-violent alternative.
Response.
Now, you say to me, listen, you could say, what I've heard my whole life is, yeah, but what about the Nazis? So the Nazis are coming in. We know in 3 nations that non-violent resistance was tried, and where it was tried against the Nazis, it worked. Denmark, Norway, and Bulgaria. Go and study it. Nobody talks about that.
Where did you say Denmark? Bulgaria?
Denmark, Norway, and Bulgaria. Study the nonviolent resistance to the Nazi invasion. The Nazis came in and took over. It's the same as Russia. And so this is the same as the US trying to invade or take over Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador. So it's the same theory of occupation, invasion, war, colonialism, imperialism. And that's the way of the world. And Jesus saying there is an alternative, nonviolent resistance. And you see it to the end in Mark. And Mark uses very weird language to try to mobilize the disciples, things like that. We have 10. So thanks, Lizanne. I hope that was helpful. We have 10 more minutes. Let's see. I see one comment, and if there's a hand raised. So, John Ennis, are you reading Paul Eli's book? John, can you wave your hand wherever you are?
He's next to you.
So I can see you again. There you are. So you're reading that book right now? You can unmute yourself if you want.
Yeah, I was hoping to finish it today. I've got like 15 pages left. And
It's
life gets
such
busy.
an incredible book. I don't know if you've all read it. It's a 4-part biography of Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, remind me, Flannery
Walker
O'Connor,
Percy.
and Walker Percy,
Yeah.
and how their lives were all intertwined.
Yeah.
However, John, Paul, whom I know, and I've told him this, he didn't like it, we have counted over 800 mistakes in the chapter on Merton alone.
Really.
The book is full of holes, but his writings in that book on Dorothy Day Against War are the finest writings I've ever seen. Yes, he footnotes me because the monastery twice gave me Merton's Hermitage to live in for a month each time. And the first time I published my journal about it. So that's why he's referring to me. That's a book which is still in print.
Okay, that's in your journal.
I don't remember what it's called. The Sound of Listening, I think. I was being poetic. I was young. So do you have an index plan for the future? You mean from this big book?
Yes.
No, but you can find that kind of thing in Ched's book. I think he's got an index. But you know, John, you don't really need anybody else's index. I've said this at the beginning of the class, I think. I am a really big fan. I don't know if you all can see my Bible here. A really big fan of the New American Bible. You know, there's like 50 different kinds. This is the red paperback edition. It's published by the U.S. Catholic bishops. What happened was, though, after Vatican II, they got the greatest scholars in the world to do a new translation of the scriptures, and I think it's the best. And John, it has 2 sets of footnotes, 2 incredible sets of footnotes. So a lot of my writing is just looking at the footnotes from this book, and it's this book costs $5. Not at Amazon, the bishop. So it's really, that's the one to get and study the footnotes. Okay, Melanie, wherever you are, thanks, John. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, and then I see one other. And then I'll go to you, Ryan. Melanie, go ahead, unmute yourself if you're there. And then-
Yeah, thank you. So I'm also really new to this. I think I heard you on a podcast recently. Don't ask me which one, because it could have been multiple ones that I've been listening to. But I've been thinking about this for a long time, like nonviolence. Even in college, when I read the just war theory, I was like, I don't think there is a just war. I think that God is asking us to be peaceful and work together. And so anyway, I'm so happy. I bought your book on living a nonviolent life. And so focusing first on not being violent to myself, but I was just, I feel like this is a really like minor example, but when I learned about like eating healthy, I went to the grocery store and realized there wasn't a lot of food that I could buy in the grocery store and eat healthy. And I feel like nonviolence in a much bigger way is like that. As soon as I learn about like, what are all of the behaviors that I have in our society and culture, it's really almost every place I turn, it's causing harm to someone. So example of Amazon, right? So we can rate your book on Amazon, but Amazon is terrible for employees. If Bezos gave $1 million to every employee, he'd still have so much money left. And so like, you know, do you have to sort of decide what the, you know, are you going to, do you have to pick, like, are we going to be against nuclear weapons? I'm going to be against war in general. Like I'm trying to figure out, how do I live my life? And you said this the first session, like, we're not going to do it perfectly. So yeah, like I feel like it's overwhelming, but I also feel like you said earlier, like I need to act. Don't wait until I figure it out, because it'll be too long. So I'm just looking for your guidance, and feel free to tell me I just don't get it yet.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That's fine. No, I don't get it. We all don't get it. And I'm trying to figure all this out too. And of course, you don't have to order any books on Amazon, and they're all atrocious. Frank was, asking what he could do to support the book, and it's very hard to promote books. You cannot publish a book in the United States with the word nonviolence in the title. And you say that's ridiculous. I've talked to over 50 publishers about that. I'm famous among publishers for talking with them about that. I've been rejected by all of them. And I had a lifetime contract with Random House. They don't sell. I can go give you, it's only word of mouth, bottom up, but a review on Amazon is how some good books are getting out there. People just have no idea. You wouldn't know there was a book on reading the gospel from nonviolence. No one even knows about it. So how do we get the word out? This is my concern. How do I share this information? How do we witness? How do we practice nonviolence? The same with food. I think it is overwhelming. I think it's totally life-changing nonviolence. And remember, Melanie, that the pitch in the Nonviolent Life book is it's 3 simultaneous practices. Nonviolence to yourself, at the same time, nonviolence in all toward every human being and the creatures and creation. And at the third time, you have to be involved. You can't, everyone says, I'm going to get him working for peace and justice when I'm perfectly peaceful and nonviolent. That is not the Christian way. That's not what I'm talking about. It's just hard to unpack the story, so I wrote it that way. But oh yeah, clothes, food, everything has to change. I used to, when I was a kid, I went to Duke, and all my clothes said Duke. I didn't realize that. And then I decided to give my life to Jesus. And I was just this walking advertisement for Duke. So I gave away all my clothes. My parents thought I was nuts. Can you believe that, Ruth? Anyway, and it's been downhill ever since. But yeah, you just have to keep making, you have to make choices. But Melanie, all these questions are questions for Jesus. See, this is where you were really discerning between goods and discipleship. This is Mark's call to radical discipleship to Jesus, where you go in your prayer time every morning and say, okay, Jesus, number one, I got this guy telling me about nonviolence, and he says you're nonviolent. What the heck does that mean? Is that true? Are you nonviolent? I want to follow you. I like you. How do I be nonviolent? What do I do? How am I violent today? How am I violent to myself, and how can I be less violent to myself? You know, and think about the one person in your life who just rubs you the worst way, the most difficult person in your life. Go and say, Jesus, how do I be nonviolent to that person? If you do that, you will get an answer. And then which cause do I need to get involved in? What do I need to do? I am very involved in lots of things, but I've spent the last 48 hours working full time on a poor guy on death row in Texas who's supposed to be executed tonight, named Ivan Cantu. And I've been working with lawyers and Martin Sheen and Sister Helen Prejean trying to stop the execution. I did not plan that yesterday or today. I don't have time to do that, but it happened, and I've been praying over it, and it's what I've been working on. I'm just telling you this, Melanie, because it just happened in my life. You just discerning and ask. So we're talking in the end, total radical obedience to God and surrender. And God is total nonviolence, and you're living with Christ and Jesus, I mean, and God. And so, and in that spirit, so you're happy to not be violent anymore. By the way, it makes you feel good. And to reconcile with people is a good thing. And to try to make a difference, holy Toledo, what a great thing to be doing with your life. So yeah, and I made a million mistakes, and maybe you will too, Melanie, I don't know. But I encourage you on the journey. It's the best thing we can do with our lives in this insane world. And so I hope you will continue to study that book and this gospel book, but mainly read the gospels and keep getting to know, have a relationship with the nonviolent Jesus, and talk to him about these things and journal what he says and mull on it and start slowly, one day, one step at a time, allowing God to disarm your heart and disarm your life to the point that you are just becoming a public figure for peace. Thanks, Melanie. Okay, Ryan, now's your big chance. What was your
John,
question?
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have to ask this because it came up last time, and I would say what the biggest Bible commentary in the last year has been The Chosen. Like hundreds of millions of people all over the country are diving into this show. I think it's cute, but it's kind of absurd. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I'd also love to hear, have you considered reaching out to those producers, talking with them? You have any connection?
Say that
with,
again. I heard up to, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then you broke up.
Yeah, have you reached out to the producers of that show? Have you talked to those people? Because this is talk about a national Bible commentary, probably unlike anything we've ever seen. So your thoughts on The Chosen, and then have you taken any steps with them to discuss this nonviolent Jesus?
Well, thanks so much, Ryan. And I saw you had a question about resurrection nonviolence being contagious. Do you want me to talk about that too?
Wasn't a question, it was just your quote when you were kind of doubting yourself. I said, hey, you yourself wrote that
Yeah,
this
I
will
know.
become more and more contagious over
Yeah, I
time.
wasn't really doubting myself, but anyway, thanks for reminding me.
Yeah.
That's great. I have not watched The Chosen deliberately, and have chosen not to watch The Chosen. And I've been told over the years, I got to be watching The Chosen. And I looked up it, read about it, and decided not to, and did not reach out to them. I have reached out to Martin Scorsese, who is friends with friends of mine, and is about to start filming a massive, big, new, never been done before movie, the movie of his whole life's work on Jesus. And I'm very worried, and I'm still, I tried last week, and I'm still working on that. I have agents in Hollywood right now for 5 years. Some of you know this. I've been working really hard to get a big Hollywood movie made about the Berrigans. And I have been involved in talking with filmmakers and actually personally stopped Mel Gibson from making his movie about Martin Luther King. Thank you very much, because it was going to be so awful, so god awful what he was going to do. Spielberg is now going to has bought all the rights for a movie on King. Anyway, I saw what you were saying, Ryan, that was the way The Chosen was. So I never have watched an episode deliberately, but I don't really have TV, and I don't have TV channels. I used to have Netflix, but now I don't. And it's not that noble. It's just I forget to pay my bill, and I'm not that organized. And then my TV fell and broke, and I got lazy.
John, you can watch it for free on your phone if you're curious. You go to
No,
Angel.
no,
Yeah.
Ryan.
Okay.
I know you're
not. I don't.
You can't. I'm an old guy. I can't. I have no apps. I got nothing. I can't use this. I have a stupid phone. And you ask my friends, they'll tell you what a klutz I am. But they're
So
different.
John,
kids.
real fast, why wouldn't you write them? I'm curious. Why wouldn't you watch an episode and write them?
Because I spent 5 years, 20 hours a day writing the Gospel of Peace.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I was working 20 hours a day, as I have been this today and yesterday, on all kinds of issues. I'm involved in so many things, I can't even keep track of it. I'm inundated with emails and calls. I'm in the middle of a 65-city speaking tour. I'll be in Oklahoma tomorrow, and Missouri on Friday, Kansas on Sunday, Saturday, Iowa on Monday, and Chicago on Tuesday. Every day. My whole year is like that, and my whole life is like that. So I'm always trying to discern what's the best use of my time. And I'm doing it all poorly, Ryan. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't claim anything. I do claim to be trying to follow Jesus, however poorly. As a friend of mine says, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly. That's my motto. And that's why I say,
Awesome.
Jesus, so don't you have anybody better to do this for? Anyway, you write to the go get the head of The Chosen.
I can write to them. I mean, they won't read them, but I'll write to them. Why not?
Yeah, you
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
They
absolutely.
might, or tell them about my book. But it's too late. They've already finished it. I did, did you see the movie, something like A Quiet Life, about Franz Jägerstätter? Maybe some of you saw it. Yeah, it was made by Terrence Malick, who's friends of mine, and I wrote him, and he sent me a ticket to the premiere, and I went to the premiere because I was friends of the Jägerstätters, and it was good. And he used my stuff to make the movie, so I was quite pleased with it. My big goal right now is the Berrigan movie, and I'm a little worried about it because what if A Hidden Life? Thank you, David. What if the Berrigan movie got picked up? And they started to do a fake story like they were doing with Martin Luther King, like Mel Gibson was doing with Martin Luther King. Hey, folks, it's like midnight, and I'm talking about Hollywood here. We're not talking about nonviolent resistance and taking up the cross. Ryan, you're getting me off track.
I had to get out of the way. It was just on my mind.
Yeah. Well, we got to get back on track. I have no idea if any of this was helpful, folks, but you see what I am passionate about is these Gospels are fantastic. The writing is spectacular. The more you dig into them, the richer and better they get, and the more you can continue to dig into them. And if you apply a Gandhian Kingian hermeneutic, holy Toledo, it gets even richer, and there's hope. And not just, back then, it's for our own lives today and the world. So I do invite you to talk about nonviolence and the nonviolence of Jesus and study it like Melanie is doing. And like I said at the beginning, to figure out what new action you can take. And I'll end with this. And then I'll turn off the recording and stay on for a few minutes. If you take Mark's ending seriously, with the angels saying to the women, you have to go back to where the story began if you want to meet the Holy One, then you and I have to go back to our own Galilees and start the story all over again and make our own campaign.
There's one simple vision hack anyone can use to improve vision. So you can
So we have to continue, carry on our own campaign of
Right.
nonviolent resistance.
Help as much as possible.
I'm not seeing where that's coming from, John. I'm gonna-
So we have to enter the story if we want to meet Jesus, and I encourage you to do that, to keep taking public action and be involved to meet the risen Jesus. If Daniel Berrigan were here, he would say, he would put it like this: I'm happy to say I have not been disappointed. So my promise is, if you do this, you will not be disappointed. Thank you very much for listening. Next week, Gospel of Luke, very exciting. And that'll wrap up the class. Write me if you have any comments or questions, and I'll sign off now, but stay on for a minute. Thanks very much. God bless you, and see you next week with the last class.